Hello and welcome. Civil rights demonstrations, anti-war activism and other reform movements of the 1960s are credited with changing society. But how significant has that change been? Disillusion still marks public sentiment for many, even half a century later, with people unhappy with governments and social injustice today. Recent protests across Europe over tuition fees and tough government austerity measures are becoming increasingly heated and reminiscent of the 1968 student demonstrations that threatened to topple ruling administrations. On today's show, we ask, how much did the 60s set the foundation for progressive reform, and what can today's organisers learn from that era? Remember, you can join our conversation by phone, email and SMS text messages with your questions and comments. With me here to discuss this, our longtime social activist and writer, Tom Hayden. In 1962, he wrote the Port Huron Statement, which is considered to be one of the founding documents of the 60s student movement. He's also the author of The Long 60s, from 1960 to Barack Obama. Mr. Hayden joins us from Los Angeles. And from Cardiff, Wales, we have Kim Howells. Before serving as a British Labour MP and holding numerous ministerial positions, Dr. Howells was a student activist and led his peers in the 1968 takeover of what was then known as Hornsey College. Gentlemen, I welcome you to the show. And Tom Hayden, if I could start with you and ask that basic question, how much do you think the 60s did really set the foundations for what social reform became and how it applies today?
Well, I don't think the 60s are quite over. Many of us are still here. I think that the Cold War has been replaced by the global war on terrorism with great consequences for this country and for Europe, the rest of the world. And I would hope that the European protests will increase when President Obama meets with the NATO ministers to propose a 4-year plan for 4 more years of war in Afghanistan. I think the parallel is that, for instance, if you take the UK budget, the sacrosanct part of it is the British Special Forces for use in southern Afghanistan. Cuts for students, cuts for universities, all that's on the table, but not Afghanistan.
Let me ask you.
This is very similar to the.
Well, yeah, that's what I'm going to ask you then, Mr. Hayden. You look at what was going on in the 1960s, of course, with the protests against the late 60s and into the 70s against the Vietnam War, and you look at the activism that's taking place against the war in Iraq and the war in Afghanistan, which now has been running longer than Vietnam. What comparisons do you see? What perhaps have today's protesters done wrong in comparison?
There's no wrong here. The difference, and I'm speaking only from North America, is in our country, number one, we don't have the coercive draft, and so there's almost no pressure on students, on younger people that there was when I was facing the draft. Secondly, the economy, the problem of student debt, the problem of jobs is a shadow over the next generation that we didn't feel in the 1960s. I think the long war, which is a Pentagon doctrine for 50 to 80 years of war, trillions of dollars, enormous costs, is invisibly eating into the resources that should be available for university education and jobs.
Well, Dr. Kim Howells, if I could bring you in here, sir, and ask you what parallels you see with what's going on in the US, with what's going on in Europe, and of course last week we saw what was happening with students in the UK. That was it's been quite a while since we've seen anything like that, certainly in the United Kingdom.
Well, we've had a lot of industrial protests, workers trying to defend their jobs and their conditions of work and their salaries, but we've seen very little protests from students until last week, that is. And what happened there was that there was a march that wasn't very big, certainly not by 1960s standards, but it was a march against proposals to increase tuition fees. And it seems to have got taken over by a very small group of people who took it upon themselves to smash in and wreck the Conservative Party headquarters, which is quite close to Parliament. And that became a huge news item. And there's been lots of speculation that it's a kind of return to 60s street activism. But as Tom has just said, it's a very, very different time now. You know, the Soviet Union was kind of ruling the roost in the East in the 60s. There was the same worries about jobs were absent then. They're not absent now. They're very much to the fore. So and there's a new kind of globalization, which means that all of our fates are linked, no matter where we are in the world.
It's interesting though, Dr. Howells, we're seeing video of what was going on with the student protest there, and it's like a violent frenzy. I mean, this is something, as I say, we haven't seen for a long time. I wonder to what degree new technology and social mobilization, you know, the internet and tweeting and so on, had until perhaps what we are seeing with these pictures, had essentially replaced the way students and young people protested, that they had the cyber world, you know, to be able to express their views, and somehow it's manifested onto the streets in much more violent form.
Well, I've actually been in Afghanistan and in Iraq when I began to realize there that the communications that were available to our troops, our men and women who are out there, our aid workers, that they were able to contact home with incredibly more facility than they were able to do in any previous war, and that it's kind of impossible to hide anything anymore. And so the debate about what should happen in Afghanistan, which I welcome very much, by the way, that debate is no longer limited to a certain group of people or to aficionados of political debate at home. It's open to everyone, especially to the people who are actually involved in the conflict.
Right. Tom Hayden, an email, if I could, that we got from our viewers. We put emails to our guests here, and this one's from Holland, from Colin Brace. If I could put this to you, it says, why didn't the substantial achievements of the 1960s activists translate into resilient political power? Much of their success is currently being rolled back, such as their commitment to the poor and to minorities.
It could be unique to our country, but I think the success was more cultural than political. Consciousness changed, attitudes changed on the environment, for example, on the wars. For instance, vast majority of Americans are against Afghanistan. That's a legacy of the 60s. I don't know what would have happened if we had not had the assassinations, if John Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, Martin Luther King, and others had lived. We might have seen a peaceful electoral transition to a more progressive government, but we'll never know. But those murders substantially diminished any possibility of a political legaze from the 60s.
Well, Dr. Howells, an email, if I could, to you from Kenya, and this one from a viewer by the name of Abdize says, the 60s were about people uniting. Now the world is disintegrating into smaller units of racial and religious intolerance. Your view on that?
No, I don't think that's true. I think people look back at the 60s now through rose-tinted spectacles. There were plenty of splitters. There were plenty of countries that were riven with civil wars. There were some terrible things going on at that time. And the idea that people were coming together, I think, is the biggest misunderstanding of what went on in the 1960s. Even within the left in Britain, and I'm sure that Tom can talk about the left in America, there was no one you loathed more than the faction that was competing with you for what they saw as political support in the country. And I've never believed this stuff, actually. I think that above all, the left is prone to splitting, is prone to factions like nothing else is, really.
Well, Dr. Howells, take me back to 1968 and the mindset of yourself and the students as you held that sit-in at Hornsey College of Art. It was the longest sit-in, I gather, in UK history still.
It was indeed, and I mean, we certainly believed that we could change the world. That was why we were doing it, and we were coming from a particular position, and students at different institutions came to radicalism through different ways, and they had different aims. Ours was that culture, that the creation of art and film and television should have some real social consequences and not just be the property of the rich, of people who could afford to buy paintings and sculpture and so on. So it was a very different mindset. It wasn't overtly political at first. It became political because of the way in which the establishment reacted to it. They saw it as a threat to their power, to their, what on the left we used to call their hegemony.
Interesting point. I wonder, Tom Hayden, to what degree perhaps the media of today, you know, the movie industry and the way sort of advertising and you know, the television world has changed consumers into such big consumers that they sort of forget about other things, that you know, the mood has been shaped by consumerism nowadays.
Well, I think that was also true in the 60s. The problem is the manipulation of memory. It seems to me we forget that the 60s took place, speaking from this country, in an atmosphere in which blacks had no voting rights, women were second-class citizens, 18 to 21-year-olds could be drafted for Vietnam but could not vote. They were treated like children in the universities, legally speaking, and so it was no wonder that there was an outside-inside dichotomy. Now things have changed substantially in terms of the enfranchisement, for example, and a lot of 60s people are in the institutions. But what has not changed was the effort to end poverty, which began in the 60s and ended really in Vietnam, was a failure. Is it any wonder that students in Britain are angry when only 10 years ago I used to give talks about how higher education in Britain was free. Right. And now they're talking about doubling it, expanding it, 10,000 equivalent of US dollars. They're talking about cutting humanities and other things. The market philosophy has prevailed, even though we have more social equality. The economic and educational inequities are still there. No wonder the students are mad. They should be mad.
We have to take a short break right now. More of our discussion on the legacy of the 60s in just a moment. We'll be right back. Welcome back. We're discussing student movements of the 1960s and what legacy they have for today's social activists. Joining me are Tom Hayden, an early leader of the 60s group, Students for a Democratic Society. Today he's the director of the Peace and Justice Resource Centre in Culver City, California, from where he joins us. And in Cardiff, Wales, we have former British Labour MP Kim Howells. In his student days, Dr. Howells was a leader in the Hornsey Art School Revolution of 1968. And Dr. Howells, a question for you from a viewer, if I may, that came in from Greece, from Eric Milano, who says, those who came of age in the 1960s would never have believed that 40 years later we would be fighting another disastrous war abroad. Can today's generation overcome their own doubts and cynicism?
Well, I think every generation has doubts and every generation becomes cynical. And it's because of something, or it was an observation that was made by a former British Prime Minister, Harold Macmillan, who said that it wasn't strategies that drive governments and politicians. It was, he said, events, dear boy, events. And these events can range from economic crashes to 9/11s, and they drive the political reaction in countries. And politicians change and governments change. And of course they have to, because they have to adapt to these different circumstances. So I don't think that there's some kind of a paradigm, some kind of an unbreakable ideology that was present in the 60s but isn't present in 2010. I think that that's the biggest misreading of all of what happens to politics.
Although, Tom Hayden, the global landscape has changed. And I wonder, when you look at obviously the end of the Soviet Union, it changed the paradigm for the US. I wonder to what degree America needed an enemy, and perhaps now that's the reason for this so-called war on terror, the fact that we have now, I guess, Muslims at the center of much of the fear and sort of reaction.
Well, we have a frontier culture, and so the enemy has generally been defined as out there somewhere, not in here in the United States. But we were attacked on 9/11. Some people doubt that, but I think that's a pretty settled fact. And with 9/11 came a whole new apparatus, greater secrecy, more spying, special forces, roundups, Guantanamo, and a license to kill in many countries, the long war on terror. And the effect of that is, I guess I would say the lesson is these issues remain unsettled. Even the Crusades is unsettled. The achievements of the 60s are unsettled because there are always people that want to use the excuse of the war on terrorism to say we can no longer fund health care, education, environmental reform, and so on. So the answer to the question from Greece, which is a land of much greater historical weight than the United States, is that there's a permanence to these struggles. And maybe it was an illusion to think if we elect a president or pass a civil rights law, we can retire and enjoy the benefits. Actually, when you achieve something, in my own experience, the ferocity of the counter movement can become greater because they perceive the loss and they become more disturbed, while the people in the social movement that succeed tend to divide or relax or fade in the light of their success.
Right. That's an interesting perspective. Kim Hauser, I wonder, sir, to what degree people are being distracted, though, much more nowadays, particularly in Europe, with these fairly tough government austerity measures. I mean, people, certainly in Britain, always feel like they're being hounded by the government to always pull their belts a little tighter. I wonder to what degree that's become a distraction when you look at what else is happening, Afghanistan and Iraq. They seem to be falling by the wayside for the British public.
Well, the big story is certainly about the austerity measures. It's about how we try and reduce our national debt and how we try and reinvent and rejuvenate our economy. And of course, that's the big story, because that's how people earn their livings. It's how they pay their mortgages for their homes and their rent and so on, and for their food. And I don't think it's as simple as Tom is saying, really. I think all of these things are interlinked, surely, but that there's the idea that simply if you didn't have a war in Afghanistan, you'd be able to pay for all this stuff is a nonsense, of course. The crisis, the financial crisis, is a much, much bigger one, and it's right at the heart of the capitalist system. And that's what we ought to be thinking about. Not about how we can save a few dollars here or a few dollars there. It ought to be about how we organize our international finances much better than we have done.
Tom Hayden, an email actually came in for you, if I may. I mean, you can get to respond to that in a second. But let me put this from Pablo Parado. It came actually via SMS to my computer here. And it says, in the 1960s, the state secret service tried to infiltrate and counter popular movements. How should this generation react to the government undermining social movements?
Well, they certainly did, and it could be ongoing. At the moment, the urgent issue is whether WikiLeaks can be protected from the Pentagon. There's an information war going on with WikiLeaks declassifying all this important information about Afghanistan, and the Pentagon has set up a special unit to try to destroy their servers, and that's another example about how things are not settled from the disclosure of the Pentagon Papers to WikiLeaks. There's just one straight line between secrecy and social movements. And I just want to respond. The cost of Afghanistan in the UK budget is small, but it's protected. But for the United States, it's $3 trillion for Iraq, and it will be another $1 or $2 or $3 trillion for Afghanistan. That does not include Yemen, Somalia, and the other theaters of special forces operations that are classified, ongoing, like Pakistan. So it's quite a large amount of money, and over 80 years it'll become many trillions of dollars unless it's reversed.
All right.
There's no money left in our discretionary budget, according to the congressional offices of of research. There's no more money in our discretionary domestic budget as a result of these wars. So President Obama's domestic agenda really can't be implemented because it's unaffordable as long as these wars go on.
Actually, Dr. Kim Hals, you know, one thing that obviously where the money goes, where a government spends its money, will have an impact on the way it engages with the rest of the world in terms of aid and so on. And an email that came in from Sweden, if I could put to you, sir, is from Paul Asandak, who says, the 1960s comparatively were better for developing countries. They could envisage a future full of hope. But today their economies have been held hostage by the G20 states and the IMF. To what degree do you feel that might be true?
Well, it certainly wasn't true. The terrible, terrible civil wars that were going on in Africa, terrible despotism in South America, in Southeast Asia, riven with war and corruption. I think this is a complete misreading of what was going on in the 1960s. And by the way, there is much more aid given to developing countries now than there ever has been in history, proportionally and in real terms. So I just don't see that. I think it sounds to me like some kind of a dream about what the 60s was like. It wasn't the 60s that I experienced anyway.
Well, in terms of just a quick thought, Dr. Hals, do you see the movements of today actually achieving something, perhaps like the 60s did? Just quick thought.
Yes, I think they will achieve things, and curiously, I think they'll be aided by this great crisis that we face now that penetrates every single country on the globe. Okay. This financial crisis, to get this right, we've got to work with each other. That's what internationalism should be about. Right. We've got to cooperate with each other, share ideas, and have good dialogue.
Well, Dr. Kim Hals, on that note, I thank you very much, and Tom Hayden, thank you, sir, for joining us too.
Thank you.
Thanks for being with us. You can watch our show on Facebook and see what we're up to there. You can give us feedback on the show and post your questions and comments. But on the next show, Cyprus deadlock. Greek and Turkish Cypriot leaders meet at the UN this week in what's being called a make-or-break effort to resolve a crisis that's lasted over 30 years. What initiatives are up for discussion, and is partition one of them? Tune in for that. From me and the team, we'll see you next time.